She always believed their love was built on truth and simplicity, but after Henry's passing, Margaret uncovers secrets he never spoke of. A hidden past rooted in wartime struggles, an unsent letter that shatters everything, and a quest for answers that could rewrite the story of their lives. Before we dive into this story of love, survival, and the courage to face the past, let me know where you're tuning in from today, and be sure to like this video and subscribe for more. Margaret had always considered her life with Henry to be quiet, steadfast, and comforting. They lived in a small house at the edge of a sleepy New Hampshire town, a place dominated by pine trees and shimmering lakes. The pace of life had always seemed slow, as though the outside world seldom intruded on the rolling hills and early winter snows. She relished that measured tranquility, the sense that her days could be mapped by the same routine. A gentle sunrise, coffee brewed in the old percolator, letters read at the kitchen table, a stroll to the mailbox, maybe a drive to the local grocery store once a week. Henry, in his last years, had settled neatly into retirement. He loved classical music, drifting off to the faint strains of Debussy in the evenings. He worked diligently on crossword puzzles, stack after stack that Margaret brought home from the bookstore. A retired aircraft mechanic, Henry once boasted that he could repair anything if it had a propeller or a set of wings. He was never the gregarious sort. He preferred calm conversation, a good newspaper, or an evening on the porch. After decades of marriage, Margaret believed she knew every line on his face, every nuance of his expressions, every lilt of his voice. They had no children. That was one of life's sorrows, but it was a sorrow they faced together. Then, one crisp autumn morning, Henry simply did not wake up. Margaret found him in bed, looking as though he were still peacefully asleep, his breath stilled forever. He had been nearing his 79th birthday. The doctors explained it as natural causes, a quiet end to a quiet life. Grief clung to Margaret like a shadow. She moved through the days and a days, planning the funeral, making phone calls to old friends, writing out obituary notices in shaky handwriting. It felt surreal that after so many years, she was alone in the house, with only his classical music tapes and crosswords left behind. Some weeks after the funeral, she reached the part no widow wants to endure, sorting through official paperwork. She needed Henry's death certificate to finalize insurance claims. She called the local records office, spelled out his name carefully, Henry Whitaker. The clerk promised to have everything ready in a few days. But that day came, and Margaret found herself in a drab waiting area, with flickering fluorescent lights reflecting off dingy beige walls. The clerk disappeared into a back room, rummaged for quite some time, then returned wearing a perplexed frown. "Ma'am," the clerk said politely, "are you certain this is your husband's correct name and date of birth? Because we have a record showing a Henry Whitaker who died in 1965. Margaret felt her heart flutter. She stammered a reply that there must be some mistake. The clerk shrugged apologetically, explaining that the system flagged a conflict. They asked if it was possible that Henry Whitaker, Margaret's late husband, had been using a different name originally or if he had changed it. Margaret insisted that was impossible. Henry had told her he was raised in Ohio, served in the Air Force in a logistics role, retired, then eventually settled in New Hampshire with her. There was no mention of any name changes. None of it made sense. She left the office with the matter unresolved, the clerk promising to double-check the records. The conversation played over and over in her mind. She tried to dismiss it as a clerical error, but an uneasy feeling took root. Perhaps, she told herself, Henry had occasionally mentioned vague stories from his Air Force days, but never in detail. She could barely recall much about his distant relatives. He'd said he had none living, that he was effectively alone in the world except for her. That evening, Margaret sat in Henry's study. It was a small room at the back of the house, lined with shelves of old mechanical manuals, dog-eared spy novels, and classical music records. She remembered a battered metal box Henry kept in the attic. He'd stored old documents there. She knew, but he always seemed oddly protective of it. Now she felt an insistent urge to find that box. She retrieved a steps tool, ascended into the dusty attic, and rummaged through countless cardboard crates until her hand brushed something cold and metallic. A locked box heavier than she expected. It took her a while to find the key, hidden in a disused jar of screws. Inside the box, she discovered two things: a battered leather pouch and a neatly folded newspaper clipping from the 1960s. She opened the pouch first, her pulse quickening when she realized it contained a pair of dog tags. The name engraved on them was not Henry Whitaker. It read James W. Carter. The blood type and service number were also indicated, everything distinctly belonging to some other man, certainly not the Henry she had known. Her confusion deepened when she pulled out the old newspaper clipping. Her eyes scanned a smudged headline, U.S. pilot killed in Soviet airspace crash. The article described how, in 1965, a reconnaissance flight had gone disastrously wrong. The pilot's remains were never recovered. The pilot's name was Henry Whitaker. The accompanying photo was black and white, grainy, but the face was undoubtedly that of her husband, albeit younger, with sharper features and a stiff uniform collar. Margaret's breath came in short bursts. She felt unsteady, leaning against a wooden beam to keep from collapsing. The article referred to the pilot as a hero who'd been shot down behind enemy lines. Then she noticed a line in the obituary stating that the pilot left behind no immediate family and that the remains were presumed lost. The date was 1965. How could Henry have died before she ever met him? Her mind buzzed with questions. Could her husband have assumed the identity of a dead pilot? If so, why? Or was it the other way around? Did Henry belong to a clandestine part of the military that had declared him dead for some covert reason? She forced herself to breathe calmly and read the rest of what was in the box. It contained only a single photograph. A woman and a small child, wearing what appeared to be Russian attire, possibly military or paramilitary uniforms. The edges of the photograph were tattered, and the expression on the woman's face was solemn. On the back was scribbled a date in faint pencil that Margaret couldn't decipher. Sometime after midnight, she stood in the attic with a flashlight in hand, staring at this photograph. For the first time in her marriage, she realized how little she truly knew of Henry's early life. He had never introduced her to old friends from his service years, never told stories about returning from the war. The most he ever mentioned about the Air Force was that it had been a logistic post he found uninteresting. She had accepted these omissions. Why question a man who appeared so content to live quietly? Unable to sleep, Margaret called a friend of hers from the local library, a retiree named June who volunteered with genealogical research. The next morning, June arrived with her laptop, and together they scoured archives. They discovered references to a Henry Whitaker from 1965, an Air Force pilot missing in Soviet airspace, presumed dead. They found other bits and pieces, government documents, declassified scraps from the Cold War era. The story was consistent. Henry Whitaker's plane went down. No body was recovered. Case closed. The more they uncovered, the more Margaret's hands shook. She had told June only that she was investigating a discrepancy in Henry's service records. She didn't mention the dog tags or the photograph yet. Even so, June commented that the situation was bizarre. Maybe your Henry was related to that pilot, but the photograph from the old article looks so much like him. It's uncanny. Margaret tried to keep her emotions steady, though her heart pounded with confusion and a dawning sense of betrayal. It was as though she had married a ghost, a phantom from someone else's life. Later that day, June left, promising to keep searching. Margaret locked the attic door behind her, feeling an irrational fear that she might find more secrets there. After a sleepless night, she returned to the clerk's office, demanding more information. The staff there were politely baffled, but they gave her the name of a National Archive repository that handled older military records. She made phone calls, spent hours on hold, tried to piece the puzzle together. Days stretched on, turning into weeks. Each day she found new leads. References to top-secret missions, glimpses of a hush-hush crash in Soviet territory, whispered rumors of espionage. She even found a foreign newspaper snippet from the mid-1960s that claimed an American pilot had been captured alive. Rumors swiftly denied by U.S. officials at the time. Eventually, Margaret stumbled upon a clue that shifted her entire perspective. She found references to Project Skylark, an operation apparently involving advanced aircraft technology during the Cold War. Many details were still classified, but the project's rosters listed a Lieutenant Henry Whitaker, pilot. Then, in the margin of some battered online database, she saw a note, deceased, 1965. Yet there were follow-up notations that seemed to contradict the official statement. Phrases like, no remains recovered, Soviet intelligence interest, exfiltration attempts. Margaret felt a chill each time she read these cryptic lines. Over cups of strong coffee, Margaret asked herself again and again, who was the man she married? Did he truly die in 1965? And if so, how could she have lived with him for more than 4 decades? Loving him, sharing a life? The question coursed through her days and nights. She sensed that the answer, if found, would unravel everything she believed she knew. Emboldened by desperation, she decided to hire a private investigator named Paul Davison, a retired FBI agent who had relocated to a nearby town. Paul was lean, gray-haired, with a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened intently to Margaret's story. She showed him the dog tags, the tattered photo, and the article. I can't promise miracles, Paul told her. But let me see if I can get into some old channels. Some of the men I knew back in the Bureau might have contacts in intelligence archives. Margaret nodded, relieved to finally involve a professional. She also felt a guilty twinge. Was she betraying Henry's memory by investigating him? Yet she couldn't stop. The desire to know the truth overcame every other sentiment. While Paul got to work, Margaret attempted to maintain a semblance of routine. She visited Henry's grave, a modest site with a small headstone near a towering pine tree. The official date of his death was etched on the stone, 2023. She stood there, remembering how she'd scattered a handful of wildflowers into the grave at his funeral. Now, she couldn't help but think, did the rest of the world once believe he died decades earlier, in another land? She laid a fresh bouquet at his grave, tears slipping down her cheeks. She whispered, Henry, whoever you truly were, I wish you had told me. I wish you'd trusted me. Paul's preliminary investigation yielded puzzling fragments. He discovered that Henry had indeed served in the Air Force under the name Henry Whitaker, but there was an abrupt end to the official record in 1965. The Social Security number Henry used after 1971 showed minimal credit history prior to that year. It was as if Henry had emerged from nowhere, fully formed, in the early 70s. This is typical of someone who might have had help forging a new identity, Paul explained. I'm not saying he was a criminal, but it looks like someone with resources made sure he had a fresh start. Not long after, Margaret received a phone call from June. I found a reference in a small Ukrainian forum about American prisoners in the Soviet Union, June said breathlessly. It's an old forum post, but it mentions a pilot who crashed in the 1960s, believed to have been forced to work on Soviet aircraft technology. Could that be Henry? The mention of captivity chilled Margaret to her core. She recalled the lines in those old documents suggesting the Soviets had a keen interest in the pilot. Could Henry have been captured instead of dying? Margaret decided to search for more direct evidence. She rummaged through Henry's desk, flipping through old notebooks, scanning receipts, searching for anything that might contain references to foreign places or languages. Hidden in a rarely opened drawer, beneath piles of coupons and half-finished crossword puzzles, she discovered a slip of paper with addresses in Berlin, Vienna, and a snippet of what looked like Cyrillic writing. She took it to a neighbor who was originally from Russia, a woman named Alina. Alina squinted at the scribble, then said, It's an address. Somewhere in eastern Ukraine, I think near Donetsk. That single statement sent a jolt through Margaret. Eastern Ukraine, the same region rumored to contain secret facilities used by the Soviets. Confusion tangled with fear in Margaret's heart. She recalled Henry occasionally waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, as though from nightmares. She had chalked it up to the typical anxieties of aging or old war memories. Now, she wondered if those nightmares had been far more visceral than she ever guessed. Of captivity, interrogation, forced labor. With Paul's help, Margaret began piecing together a timeline. It appeared Henry, or whoever he was, might have spent years in the Soviet Union after the crash. The official records labeled him Kia to avoid diplomatic fallout if the Soviets admitted they had captured a U.S. pilot. Henry, in effect, had died on paper so that the military and the government could move on. But the deeper truth was that he was secretly alive, a high-value prisoner. 1,000 questions came to mind. Why had he never told her? Was he ashamed, or was he sworn to secrecy? Late one evening, Margaret's phone rang. It was Paul, and his voice was electric with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "I found a reference in an old intelligence memo. Something about a prisoner exchange in 1969 that went awry. A name came up, Carter. That's the name on the dog tags you have, right?" "James Carter," Margaret confirmed. "Yes, but the dog tags. I thought it was just an alias. Or maybe it was from some other soldier." Paul was silent a moment, then said, "The memo suggests that Carter was an American with unique mechanical knowledge. Possibly an aircraft mechanic or pilot. The Soviets used him to glean insights on American aircraft designs. Then, during a prisoner handover, Carter escaped. He vanished. No follow-up in the file. It's like he disappeared completely." Margaret's breath caught. If Henry had those dog tags, maybe that name was also him, another identity he had used. She felt dizzy. "He might have been forced to work for the Soviets," she said quietly. "He always told me he was an aircraft mechanic." "Oh my God. So that was real. But it happened in captivity." Paul agreed. "It makes sense. If the Soviets realized he was skilled with planes, they'd use him. Then, if he escaped, he might have had to vanish. Maybe the name Henry Whitaker was revived, but with a new official record." Margaret slumped into a chair, tears welling. She pictured her husband in some cold Soviet facility, battered by interrogations, parted from everything he had ever known. "He never said a word," she murmured. The revelation spurred Margaret to dig deeper. She discovered a small stash of Henry's old postcards from Berlin, dated 1971. They were addressed to no one, never mailed. Each postcard showed scenes of the city, from the Brandenburg Gate to the remains of the Berlin Wall. On the back of one was a cryptic note, "I am almost home." The date was just a few months before Margaret had met Henry by chance at a local church event in New Hampshire. He had been newly arrived in town, claiming to be traveling through. She remembered how he seemed so polite, with a hint of sadness in his eyes. They hit it off immediately, an unspoken connection forging between them. Now she realized it was not happenstance. He must have chosen that place, that moment, perhaps because he had traced her from an earlier meeting. She recalled vaguely that she'd attended an Air Force function in the 1950s with a cousin who served, and that she'd chatted with a young pilot for a while. Could that have been Henry all along? She'd barely remembered that conversation, but apparently, it had burned itself into Henry's mind. He had risked everything to seek her out once he had his freedom. The notion staggered her. A man crossing oceans, forging documents, all to find a woman who might barely recall him. Yet, if it was so romantic, why had he kept it secret? Perhaps fear of dragging her into espionage controversies or being targeted by Soviet agents. The paranoia of the Cold War still lingered, even into the 1970s and beyond. The thought of it made Margaret's heart ache. She wished he had trusted her. She would have embraced him, scars and all. Driven by a mixture of longing and heartbreak, Margaret delved into foreign archives, which was daunting for a solitary widow from New England. She sought help from people fluent in Russian and Ukrainian, scouring online message boards, contacting embassies, emailing experts in Cold War history. Most leads turned to dead ends. But occasionally, a fragment of information surfaced. Rumors of a breakaway group of KGB defectors who might have helped certain American prisoners escape, scattered references to an underground route that let people slip across borders in Eastern Europe. At night, Margaret dreamt of Henry wandering through bleak snowscapes, dodging border guards, forging new identities at every turn. She'd awaken sweaty and shaken, her mind swirling with the enormity of it. She still felt his presence in their house, as though a single door might open and she'd find him at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, tackling a crossword clue. She missed his gentle laughter, the way he always tapped his foot to the cello parts in orchestral pieces, the comforting warmth of his presence at her side. Yet she also felt waves of sorrow for the part of him she never knew. The pilot lost behind enemy lines, the desperate prisoner forging a path back to freedom. Weeks later, she received a cryptic email from a Russian historian who specialized in declassified Soviet-era documents. He claimed to have come across references to an American pilot named Henry W. In a series of interrogation transcripts from 1965 to 1968, the pilot was forced to share knowledge about aircraft engineering. The transcripts indicated that he refused to cooperate fully, often giving partial or misleading information. The historian attached a passage from the transcript. In it, the interrogator threatened to withhold food and heat if the pilot would not detail certain engine schematics. The pilot responded with defiance, referencing that no matter what they did, he wouldn't betray the deeper secrets of his craft. Reading these lines, Margaret had to set her computer aside, tears flowing. She could almost hear Henry's voice in those bold words. His quiet resolve turned unbreakable under duress. One crucial detail jumped out. A mention of a female prisoner named Anya, said to be a translator or a liaison. The transcript suggested she sometimes aided the pilot by secretly bringing him supplies or offering minor assistance. Could Anya be the woman in that photograph from the pouch? The historian, however, had no further leads about what became of her. The records ended abruptly in 1968, around the time the pilot was moved to a different facility. Obsessed with finding more, Margaret posted inquiries in forums, searching for any sign of an Anya who had been a Soviet prisoner in the 1960s. First, nothing came. Then, almost a month later, she got a message from a user claiming to be a granddaughter of a woman named Anya who had once been incarcerated in a secret base. The woman now lived in a remote Polish village. The user wrote in broken English, suggesting that if Margaret wanted to meet Anya, she should come in person. Margaret's chest tightened. Was this the same Anya who had helped Henry escape? Summoning her courage, Margaret began to plan a trip. She had never traveled overseas, nor had she ever considered stepping foot in Eastern Europe. But the day after that message arrived, she found herself making phone calls to check plane ticket prices, investigating Polish travel requirements, scrawling a to-do list. She was terrified. She was old, grieving, and used to the comforts of home. Yet she felt Henry guiding her forward, urging her to unearth the truth. The notion that she might talk to someone who had known Henry in that captive environment was exhilarating and terrifying. Before she departed, Margaret found something else. A letter hidden in the lining of one of Henry's old suitcases. She decided to use that old suitcase for her travels, as it was sturdy, though battered with age. While cleaning it out, she noticed a loose seam in the lining. Curious, she tugged on it, discovering an envelope stuffed inside. The letter was addressed to Margaret, dated 5 years before they officially met. She recognized Henry's handwriting immediately. With trembling hands, she read, "My dearest Margaret, I know you may not recall the day we met so many years ago, back when I was a proud young pilot and you were visiting your cousin at the base. I never forgot the moment you laughed at my terrible joke, your eyes warm and bright. In the hardest nights of my captivity, the memory of your laughter kept me alive. I have discovered that you live in New Hampshire, and I swear I will find a way to see you again. I cannot tell you what I have endured or why I have been away, but please believe me. You are the reason I am returning to America. If fate is kind, we will meet, and I hope we can build a new life, free from the shadows. I am not the same man I was, but perhaps I can become better if I am with you. For now, I carry your memory as a beacon. Forgive the lies I will have to tell. Forgive the secrets. All I ask is that if you ever learn the truth, you remember how deeply I have cherished you, since the first day our paths crossed. Henry." Margaret's tears soaked the paper. It was like receiving a final confession from beyond the grave. He had known her from that fleeting encounter. He had sought her for years, risking everything to find her. The implications were mind-boggling. He built a new identity, returned to the U.S., found her, orchestrated a chance meeting. All that effort, all that secrecy, because she had been a bright spot in his darkest days. He must have feared that revealing his past might put them in jeopardy, or that she would reject him upon learning the extent of his deception. In that moment, Margaret's grief deepened, yet a tender warmth filled her. She understood the depth of Henry's love, how it transcended ordinary bonds. The life they shared was not a lie, but a testament to his will to survive and reclaim some fragment of happiness. Armed with this letter, Margaret embarked on her journey. It was the first time she had traveled alone outside the country. The flight to Europe felt surreal, a haze of cramped airplane seats and dull engine hums. She clutched Henry's letter in her purse, reading it again whenever fear threatened to overwhelm her. She landed in Warsaw, navigating the busy airport with timid determination, then took a train toward the southeastern reaches of Poland. The landscape whipped by her window. Rolling fields, quiet villages, forests turning gold in the summer sun. She felt she was crossing into Henry's hidden world, one step at a time. Eventually, she arrived at a remote village near the Ukrainian border, its dusty roads flanked by old stone houses. She had an address scribbled on a slip of paper, courtesy of Anya's granddaughter. When she found the house, it was a modest structure with a thatched roof in partial disrepair, goats milling around a small pen outside. A woman in her 20s answered the door, eyeing Margaret with curiosity. She led her inside to a dimly lit room where an elderly woman sat by a window, knitting. Her hair was white, her face lined with the tracks of a life not easily lived. The granddaughter spoke to the older woman in Polish. Then the woman turned her gaze on Margaret, tears welling. It was Anya. Through the granddaughter's halting translation, Margaret introduced herself, explained she was the widow of Henry Whitaker, the American pilot who had been held in captivity. Anya let out a trembling breath. She murmured something in Polish, and the granddaughter explained. She says she never knew his real name was Henry. She only knew him by the name James Carter. But she recognizes him from the photograph. Margaret swallowed a lump in her throat, retrieving the old photo from her purse. She showed it to Anya, who nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. In that hush of the little house, Margaret felt time stretch. Then Anya beckoned her closer, reached into a trunk, and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. She pressed it into Margaret's hands. The granddaughter explained that Henry had left it behind during the escape, or rather, he had given it to Anya for safekeeping when they feared a search. After the chaos of the escape, they had never met again, and she had kept the notebook for decades, uncertain if Henry lived. Now it was Margaret's to claim. With trembling hands, Margaret flipped through the pages. It was written in English, Henry's scrawling script. She read snippets describing the horror of the crash, the jarring moment Soviet soldiers surrounded him at gunpoint, the endless days in a cell, the forced labor on Soviet aircraft components. She found heartbreaking passages where Henry wrote of the mental anguish, the solitary nights, the terror that he might never see home again. But scattered throughout were mentions of a memory that kept him going. A woman named Margaret, whom he'd met only once. She had a gentle laugh that lit my mind, he wrote, like a lantern in the darkness. In some pages, he described how he told himself stories each night about that brief encounter, weaving entire conversations in his imagination to stave off madness. He recounted the brutal interrogations, how Anya had risked her own life to slip him extra rations. He shared his plan to feign compliance in order to gain trust, then escape. The final entry spoke of the actual escape, aided by Anya's knowledge of guard routines and the presence of certain ex-KGB agents who opposed the system. Then a final page read, I have managed to cross into West Berlin. There is hope. My new forged identity is prepared. Soon I will find Margaret. If she does not remember me, I will have to court her all over again. But that's a joy I welcome. I choose to believe she will see the man behind the secrets. I have died once as a soldier. I will live again as a husband. For the first time in years, I feel alive. Margaret wiped her tears, reading that final line again and again. Anya watched her quietly. The granddaughter explained that Anya had always wondered if the man survived. Now, seeing Henry's widow appear, the circle was complete. Margaret reached out and clasped Anya's wrinkled hands, whispering words of gratitude. She understood that without this woman's bravery, Henry might never have returned to America, and Margaret might never have found the love that defined her life. They spent the evening talking. Through halting translations, Anya described how Henry had been frail and malnourished, but his spirit burned bright. He worked tirelessly on aircraft schematics, but never gave the Soviets exactly what they wanted. She described the terror of the facility, the cruelty of certain officials, but also the small acts of mercy among prisoners. When Margaret showed the letter Henry wrote her years before they met, Anya wept softly. The granddaughter explained that her grandmother always believed that if Henry lived, he would find some happiness. Now, hearing that he had decades of a loving marriage, Anya felt relief. Margaret realized that in her grief, she had at least one solace. Henry had fulfilled his mission. He had found the life he yearned for, even though it was built on secrets. Margaret stayed in the village overnight, sleeping in a small guest room. She kept Henry's notebook under her pillow, as though it were his presence. She dreamed of him standing at the edge of a cold forest, beckoning her. In the morning, before departing, Anya gave Margaret one final gift, an old piece of cloth with Soviet insignias, likely ripped from a uniform. Henry had once told Anya that if he ever escaped, he would burn the symbol that had kept him captive. But apparently he never got the chance. Margaret accepted it, tears falling as she murmured thanks. She and Anya embraced for a long time, two elderly women connected by the memory of a man who had existed in two worlds and survived them both. Returning home to New Hampshire, Margaret felt fundamentally changed. The trip had exhausted her, both physically and emotionally, yet she felt a deep sense of closure forming. She now fully knew what Henry had endured, understood why he hid his past and how he had cherished her. He had died once as a soldier, declared lost by the government. Then he had lived quietly as her husband, building a new life. Finally, he had died a second time, in their bed, in the home they had shared for so many years. But his love, his spirit, those lived on in the notebook and the memories Margaret now held close. She decided to do something with the knowledge. She would write a book, an account of Henry's life from the crash to the Soviet captivity, the escape and his journey back to her. She wanted the world to know not just a tale of Cold War espionage, but a story of devotion, of how a simple memory of a kind stranger could become a beacon. It took her months to gather all her notes. She drew from the notebook, from the transcripts, from her own recollections of Henry's mannerisms and quiet confessions. The writing process was cathartic. Each page she typed brought her closer to him, as though they were engaged in the longest, most intimate conversation they'd ever had. At times, Margaret found the emotional toll overwhelming. She would stop in mid-sentence, recalling how Henry's eyes would crinkle at the corners when he smiled. She'd weep or laugh softly to herself, remembering some small anecdote that now felt laced with deeper significance, like how he always insisted on sitting with his back to the wall in restaurants, or how he once flinched upon hearing fireworks on the 4th of July. She understood now that these quirks were vestiges of a man who had spent years in captivity, constantly on edge. Slowly, her manuscript took shape. She titled it The Man Who Died Twice. She poured her heart onto every page, determined to do justice to Henry's resilience and the unwavering love that guided him. She wrote about meeting him at that church event, how she had no inkling that he'd traveled half the world under false names just to stand there, hoping she would smile at him again. She wrote about the decades that followed, how he had been the gentlest, most attentive husband she could imagine, always quietly protective, always reminding her how precious she was to him. She included the final letter he had hidden in the suitcase lining, letting readers glimpse the quiet heartbreak and hope that had shaped his decisions. When at last she finished, Margaret approached a local publisher who specialized in memoirs. Initially, they were skeptical, but once she showed them the dog tags, Henry's notebook, the old photograph, and the letter, the publisher realized this was more than a tall tale. It was a remarkable slice of history. They agreed to take it on. Word spread, and soon enough, Margaret found herself granting interviews, telling the story to reporters who were astonished by the revelations. Some demanded more concrete proof. She offered them transcripts, references to archival documents, even the letter. Skeptics lingered, but overall, the public was enthralled. The Cold War had ended decades ago, yet stories of hidden prisoner exchanges and secret escapes always stirred fascination. Amid this new wave of attention, Margaret never lost sight of Henry's memory. She visited his grave once more, this time carrying a single rose and a copy of the freshly printed book. Standing by the headstone, she whispered, "You wanted to keep this secret, my love, but the world needed to know your bravery, your devotion. I hope you forgive me for sharing it. I hope you see that it's my final gift to you." She opened the book to the dedication page, which read simply, "For Henry, who taught me that love can transcend every boundary." She laid the book beside the flowers. For a moment, she thought she felt a soft breeze caress her cheek, as though Henry were there, gently approving. The book found its audience. It became a modest bestseller, not because of sensational spy intrigue alone, but because of the deep human core at its center. One man's determination to survive unimaginable trials, fueled by a memory of a fleeting conversation with a woman who had unknowingly given him hope. Critics praised Margaret's heartfelt prose, and soon she received letters from around the world. Others who had endured captivity, families who had lost loved ones during the Cold War, or simply people who felt inspired by the idea that one gentle encounter could change the course of a life. A year passed. Margaret's house felt less lonely, in part because she found a sense of peace in connecting with those who read her book. She invited June and Paul over frequently, cooking simple meals, reminiscing about Henry. She donated a portion of the book's proceeds to organizations supporting veterans and victims of war. She even corresponded with Anya's granddaughter, sending care packages and updates. She had the notebook carefully translated and printed a copy in Russian for Anya, so the old friend might read Henry's words in full. Anya's granddaughter wrote back, saying that Anya cried tears of joy upon reading the translated pages, relieved to learn that Henry's last decades had been filled with the very warmth he had dreamed of during captivity. Of course, not every day was easy. Margaret still woke at times expecting to hear Henry humming a classical tune. She sometimes turned to speak to him, forgetting for a split second that he was gone. That was the nature of grief. Long, slow waves that receded but never vanished completely. Yet each time sorrow threatened to drown her, she recalled how Henry had triumphed over far more daunting forces. She reminded herself that, in the end, he died peacefully, not in some frozen cell, not in a foreign land, but in the bed they shared, with love as the final chapter of his extraordinary life. Once the media fervor settled, Margaret reflected on the possibility that Henry might have chosen to keep his secret forever, had he lived. She was certain he harbored guilt over the things he had been forced to do or reveal under interrogation. Perhaps he feared that telling her would thrust her into danger or that she would see him differently. Ultimately, she believed his choice was born from love. He wanted at least one realm of his life to be untouched by the horrors of the Cold War. He wanted a pure place, free from the illusions and spy games that had once controlled his fate. So he had built a quiet life in New Hampshire, a life where he could finally breathe freely. In the final pages of Henry's notebook, Margaret found a simple line scrawled beneath his personal reflections. It read, "I lived 2 lives, but only one was ever worth remembering." She realized how much weight that single sentence carried. His first life ended in 1965, entangled in war and covert operations. His second life began the moment he set eyes on her again, forging a path to normalcy and tenderness. He had chosen which life to cherish. Margaret decided to honor his choice by organizing one last gesture. She took Henry's ashes, which she had carefully kept in a carved wooden urn on the mantel, and drove to a secluded lake they had loved. She parked by the shore, feeling the crisp breeze rustle through the pine trees. The water was calm, reflecting the sky's pastel colors. Slowly, she opened the urn and scattered the ashes onto the surface. They drifted gently, sinking and swirling in the water that glimmered beneath the fading sun. In that still moment, she murmured a quiet farewell. "Thank you for coming back, Henry." She watched the ashes dissolve into the lake's depths, a swirl of silver in the deepening twilight. A hush fell over the scene, a reverence broken only by the soft lapping of water. Margaret breathed in the fresh air, feeling a serene acceptance. Henry's secrets were laid bare, his ashes returned to nature. The man he had become in the final chapters of his life, a loving husband, was forever entwined with her heart. The complexities of his first life did not tarnish the joy of his second. As night settled, she returned home, holding the notebook and the letter close. She felt a sense of completion, if not perfect resolution. Life would continue. She would continue. She might never fully bridge the gap between the man she knew and the prisoner who once toiled in Eastern Europe, but she had glimpsed enough to understand his soul. She would forever be grateful that he fought his way back to her. Her book, The Man Who Died Twice, resonated with readers for years to come. Some saw it as an espionage thriller. Others found in it a profound testament to love's endurance. Margaret remained humble through it all, politely declining invitations for talk shows or high-profile events. She preferred the quiet routine of her little house in New Hampshire, occasionally traveling to speak with groups of veterans or historians. In these talks, she emphasized that her story was not about heroics alone, nor about the darkness of war, but about the unbreakable thread of a human connection that can pierce even the thickest iron walls. Eventually, Margaret grew frail. Old age weighed on her, and her eyesight dimmed. But she kept Henry's notebook by her bedside, rereading the passages whenever loneliness pressed in. She found comfort in those penned words from a younger Henry, determined and hopeful. The final lines always brought a soft smile to her face, even if tears glistened in her eyes. She understood that his journey had ended in her arms, and no shadow of the past could ever diminish the reality of the life they built. Indeed, Henry died twice, but the man she cherished was not the man of warfare and espionage. It was the gentle soul who solved crosswords, listened to classical music, and adored her beyond measure. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.